So, Joe Nemmers Jr. was born and raised in Libertyville, where he attended St. Joseph Grade School and Carmel Catholic High School. His grandfather, Irv Nemmers, brought the family to Libertyville from Iowa in 1938, and his father, Joe Nemmers Sr., graduated from Libertyville High School in 1947. Today, 3 of Joe's sons and 7 of his grandchildren live in Libertyville, continuing the family's long connection to the community. Joe spent 30 years at Abbott Laboratories, retiring in 2007 as an executive vice president. He also served for 14 years in the U.S. Army Reserve. In his second act, he is the author, it sounds like a third act, Joe. And in his second act, he is the author of 12 books focused on family stories, personal narrative, and military history. His 3 most recent works form a trilogy dedicated to telling the stories of Libertyville's World War II sacrifice. He is also a member of the Libertyville Historical Society. Joe and his wife, Kathy, were both widowed before finding a second chance together. They have blended their 2 families into one with 9 adult children and 11 grandchildren. Joe and Kathy live in Lake Forest and are nearing completion of a home they are building in Kewanee, Wisconsin, near Green Bay. So we're very happy to have Joe here with tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
Thank you, Jenny. Unlike Jenny, I am not paid. I'm a volunteer. Sorry. A lot of my family is here tonight. I didn't realize that. I've got a bunch of grandkids, 2 of my sons, one of my daughter-in-laws. So the whole back rows are filled with my family. It's nice to have you here in person. We have almost standing room only here, and welcome all of you on the Zoom telecast and anybody who sees this on YouTube in the future. So that'll be fun for all of us. We are here tonight to talk about 29 Knocks on the Door, Volume 2, which is here. I'll go through the other books in a second. Before I begin, we've got some special guests. We have some members of some of the guys in the book with us here this evening. And I told them they don't have to do anything except wave when I introduce them. So the first one right over here is Joan Jennings, Libertyville native, Libertyville High School graduate. Joan's uncle was Private Russell Hapke. He was killed at the Battle of Bunagona on New Guinea in 1943. Her grandmother was Anna, and that's important because Anna appears on the side of the jacket cover in a photograph of 6 Libertyville Gold Star mothers. And so Joan donated this last year to the Historical Society and kindly gave it to me to use in the book. I interviewed her for the book as well. Also here is Celia Wilson and Patty Levasseur. Celia's brother and Patty's uncle was Sergeant Norman Ulrich. Norman was killed on the island of Laity in the Philippines in December of 1944. So welcome to all of you. And a special surprise tonight. One of my best friends from Carmel High School, Bill Werner, his mom is with us here this evening. And I didn't know until she came tonight that she had 2 brothers in the war, one over Europe and one in the Philippines. So welcome to you too, Mrs. Werner. So here is our agenda. I'll talk about the Trilogy Chronicle. It's all 3 books, as I explained to you. I'm going to talk about research and writing. I get asked all the time, how do you find all this stuff about people and how do you do it? I'm going to talk about something that someone, is a friend of mine, talked about how art creates a community and how we've created a community around these 29 men. I want to talk about what life was like here in town in 1930s and 1940s, because as we talk about these men, they lived 80 or 90 years ago. And we think about Libertyville, we got to go back a little bit and see what it was like it was during that time. And then I'll talk about the men of Volume 2. There's 15 of them in the book. I added 3 more from Mundelein, who were Libertyville High School graduates. One of them was Norman. We're not going to get through them all tonight. There won't be enough time. I'll as we go through just to give you an idea. Almost everybody in here has about 25 to 50 pages. Each guy is a chapter. So I've tried to 1 page each tonight to give you kind of the Cliff's Notes of what it looks like. On to the next slide. So for the chronology of the 3 books, during COVID, I found my way into the ASU World War II program at Arizona, which is my alma mater. 10 courses, all online, kind of interesting. I like World War II, and I thought this would be good. It was in the middle of COVID. In the process of doing that, I got through the 5th course. Halfway through, I was getting kind of bored. And I was writing a paper about the Pacific Campaign. And just by chance, I came upon some articles written by my childhood friend, Dale Eggert, who's sitting right over here, about the impact of the war on the high school and the town. I saw all these names of these guys, and I remembered, and My dad used to tell me about them. He was class of 47, a little younger than some of them, but he knew many of them or he knew their siblings. And I had heard not about all 29, but I'd heard over time in Dale's article, maybe. But in his articles was something really interesting. There were four guys from Libertyville, all joined the Marines. They were all friends, student athletes. Two were in the class of 40, 142 and 143. Joined the Marines, went, and all ended up on the island of Okinawa in April of 1945, and all were killed at that battle. None of them knew they were there, but they all ended up there. And that became this book, which is the very best we had about those four Marines. They are also in volume one. I put an abbreviated version in there for that. But that was the first of the books. So I wrote, right, I actually had all this material. Dale gives it to Laura Brandt, who's the head of the social studies department of Libertyville High School. And she says, well, why don't you come and talk to Tom Calenti's staff at the high school about what you found? So I did. This is in 2022. And I had 15 minutes for the presentation. It took an hour. It was a great conversation. And when we were done, Tom came up and he said, are you going to write a book? And I said, well, I'm in school right now. I don't think so. He goes, you're going to write a book. You must write this book. And as I've said many times since then, when I was a child, I always followed what principals said. And so this time I did, and I wrote that. So that's where the very best we had came from. Finished the book. I wasn't going to do anything else. I was going to go back to graduate school. So Libertyville High School invites me to the Writers Expo in March of 2024. It's a program that they put on to share the beauty with kids and to encourage them. So I had a presentation, and there was a Q&A afterwards, and this girl raises her hand and she says, well, I've heard you talk before, and I know there's like some other guys. When are you going to write about them? Or kind of a polite answer, you know. So this teacher raises his hand and he says, you have, just like the principal, you have to write the book about the other guys. And he said, think of it as a community service. So I came back to Kathy. I said, I think I have a book in me. I went to my faculty advisor at ASU and I said, I think I need to leave to go do this. And she said, yeah, you can. And then she laughed and she said, you won't be back, because that happens all the time. People get excited to write a book. And I never did go back. But I can tell you, I learned more in writing these 3 books in 4 years than I could have learned in 1,000 years of graduate school. So I came back, I sat down with Barry, and it's more time than we have for here today, but trying to find who were the 29 guys. It's not as easy as it sounds. So we came up with a list of who were, and I wrote what became volume. And I got about halfway through that book, and I thought, just based on the math, I ain't going to get away with this in one book. It's going to have to be 2, because, and I was right. What's happening is, had I done it all in one book, it would have been a book this big, which would have been unfair to all of you because it was 1,000 pages between the two. So I wrote volume 1, and it was published last May. And I thought, oh, this is good. Writing these books is tough. Well, it's hard physically to write these books as you're sitting there all day long. It's tough intellectually. My brain is old. It doesn't work like as well as it used to. And it's emotionally tough because these guys, there's a blank sheet of paper, and I end up finding terrible things that happen to them. And I'm like, I'm tired. I'm going to take the summer off. So that lasted about a week because I came uptown to the Field Day celebration in Cook Park. And here comes Johnson, and she gives an absolutely beautiful speech about what our responsibility is today, about how we can't forget them. They can't just be a name on a wall. We have to know their names, their stories, and those things must be preserved. So I went home and I told Kathy, I'm not taking the summer off. I got to go back to work. So I started on volume 2 and I finished it in January, and it's been out since February. So back on time, Dale Eggert got me started. The principal told me to write the first book. The student and the teacher told me to write the second one, and the mayor told me to hurry up and write the third one. So it's a village when you do these things over a 4-year period. So I get asked all the time, where do you get all this stuff from? And a lot of places. So I get it from the standard genealogy database, if you know about Family Search, Ancestry. I have a friend who owns a company that can provide military records. If you try to go to the government yourself and it's good luck, because you may never get what you want. You can provide them for me. So I got all the military service and casualty records for these 29 guys. I had to pay for them. the morning reports of each unit, which shows where they did, who showed up for duty, and the after action report, which talk about what they did in combat in any particular day. So what I was able to do for the most part is find out the information. And once they got into a theater in Europe or the Pacific, I could pretty much where they went until they were killed and until really afterwards. So a lot of that is in the book. The usual books, ebooks or regular books, online sources. I use Illinois Archives, which is a free site, which is wonderful. Jenny populates a lot of stuff from Libertyville in there. I went to Libertyville High School. They trusted me to go into the archives alone and look at the year and the Drops of Ink student newspapers, which have a ton of. Here, certainly at the Historical Society, I couldn't have done most of this stuff without Jenny's advice and guidance. And then I didn't contact the families, but I contacted a lot of them and didn't have information, but some did. I got sources from that. And then, as I'll talk in a minute, some local sources were really helpful. So I think listening or watching tonight is my friend Candace Darman, I think is in Brooklyn, New York. Candace's stepfather was Gene Cherenovich. Gene was in the class of 45. He was the younger and only sibling of Jack Cherenovich, who was one of the four Marines in the first book. She's been very helpful to me ever since. She is a retired performing arts teacher, and she helped me stylistically and stuff with the book. So I sent volume 2 a couple weeks ago, and she called me when Kathy and I were in California. And she goes, I'm going to make a statement. She said, art creates community. This is coming from an artist. Okay. And she said, you know, books are art. Your book is art. And she said, I've watched this for the last 4 years. I've seen the guys. I've seen the families. I've seen the sources, all the people that we've all met, that we've all become friends since that time. She said, a community has been created around 29 guys. And I said, well, that's a pretty cool way of looking at it. To the families, to the local people, local sources, and off to other authors have also been helpful. As an example, I met a young woman online from Okinawa. She's American. Her husband is a Marine Corps warrant officer, and she has a Facebook post called Okinawa Battle Sites, and she goes off in the caves and does all this stuff. Took a great interest in the first. And so what she did was she went to the Peace Memorial in Okinawa. She got the names of our 4 guys and did pencil rubbings, enough for each of the 4 families. Her husband went on temporary duty in Honolulu, and he went to the graves of 2 of them, Ole Ekstrom and Jack Cherenovich, and did full rubbings for each of the 4 families. So each family got one. Libertyville High School got one. And that's kind of, you know, art creates community around how we, and that's what that means. So what was life like here way back when? So we think of Libertyville today, we see it, but we have to go back and we have to progress and figure out what it looked like. It was smaller. Today it's 20 some thousand people. In the 1930s, it was 3,900, a little less than 4,000 people. So the population was much smaller, but all the towns were smaller. Mine was 1,500. Waukegan was smaller. The density was what was different. So the town boundaries back in the time these guys were growing up, you could go out to Butterfield Road to the west. You could go north to Buckley Road. You could go out east on Mary's. The biggest difference was when you went south on 21. There really was nothing past Austin or Coolidge, but where the Dairy Queen is today. That was even when that was all farmland. The difference was in town, there were houses. So if you read in the book, these guys lived on 4th Street, they lived on 5th Street, 2nd Street, Cook, Church, Maple, Brainerd, in a circumference around sitting tonight. That's where the town was. It wasn't spread out, have the kind of density it had today. And so it made, as I'll talk about in a second, a very tightly knit community. The high school played a very important role in those days for a number of reasons. One of them was it was the place to go for entertainment because everybody went and watched sports. And many of these guys in the book were star athletes, so they were well known around. The school also during the war changed the up to help it be a little bit easier for some of the guys that were going off the service, extra physical fitness stuff, extra engineering courses, and things like that. Everybody did know everybody. Okay, they lived in the same streets. These guys went to the same schools. They may have not been in the same grade. They were maybe a year or 2 apart. They were in the choir. They went to church. They played together. Their families all knew each other. It was much smaller environment than we see today. So what happened was, somebody asked me on a podcast last week, what happened when a knock on the door came? And I said, well, in a small town, when they knocked on the door, the whole town shuddered because everybody within a day what had happened, and everybody kind of came together. So one family's pain was shared by all. We need to talk about the Depression first, the 1930s, because it helped formulate what men were before they went off into combat. One of the things you see as you go through the book, and I've had people comment to me, why did these guys move so much? They were moving in Libertyville to Mundelein around all. And the answer is that during the Depression, very few people had money. They didn't have jobs. Income was scarce. It was tough on everybody. And so nobody, well, not many people owned a home. They rented houses. And the average income in the late 30s was $1,400 a year. So we have to do some math around what things looked like in those days. And you could rent a house or have a larger home for $50 a month for your family. But if you could get one for 45, you would move. So that 10% we think of $5, that's nothing. In those days, it was a lot of money. And so you'll see them move. Brown, who's in the first book, was here until 8th grade. His family moved 8 times in that time, including twice on Maple Avenue, one on one end and one to the other. And the possessions they have today. So moving was not a big deal. Jenny mentioned when my grandpa brought our family here in the years between 35 and 47, when my dad graduated, they moved 7 times around. That's what they were doing. They were just chasing lower the way to survive. And so you see that in almost every one of these 29 stories. The World War II years were very interesting, particularly the first part of the 40s. I write a lot of books on history. I was a history major. I can tell you with all certainty that there was never a more unified time in American history than World War II. Everybody on World War II. I'll give you examples in a minute, but there was one objective, and it was to win. That was what everything was about, as I'll explain. And it was to defeat Nazi Germany and was defeat Imperial Japan. And one of the things that happened, because everybody sacrificed in some, whether you were an infant or a grandpa, everybody shared some kind of sacrifice during the war. So there was rationing. Gas was rationed, food was rationed, it was rationed. It was tough to get clothes. Houses built in town because all the lumber went to the war industry, and most of the skilled tradesmen were serving in the military. You couldn't buy a new car after 1942 because the factory stopped cars and started making planes and bombs and all kinds of other things. So it was a tough time. And this was the time that these guys were either young men, their children, or they were young men during this time. One of the things of when the war started, parents of these guys, was jobs became more plentiful and jobs paid better because they were defense jobs. The problem was you couldn't spend it on anything for the first time because everything was rationed. You might be able to get a better house, but you couldn't do anything else with the money that you had. So this was kind of the set and the setting for what things looked like for these young men. They moved a lot. It was tough. The town was closer together. It was and this was the world that they lived in before they took off. So here are some of the men of volume 2. There are 14 in volume. There's 15 in volume 2. I added 3 more in volume 2, 3 men from Mundelein that were all Libertyville High School graduates, distinguished graduates. One of them was Sergeant Ulrich. We're not going to go over all of them tonight because we don't have enough time in the next 40 minutes. I'm going to try. We're going to go through some of them. Jenny wants me to point out the cemetery walk is September. Of the 29 men, that 5 are buried here at Lakeside Cemetery, and they will be the focus of the cemetery walk. And as I was telling her tonight, these 5 guys have really interesting stories. So if you're interested in the cemetery walk, it'll be kind of interesting, kind of a fun thing to do. But our guys right here that we'll talk about tonight. I'm going to show you a photo. There's going to be 1 page for each guy. It's going to have the year he was born, the year he died, his rank, and his photograph. And that's all you're going to see. Because I want you to see what I've seen the last 4 years, which are their faces all the time. And one of the things that's driven the book from the beginning has been they're not the names on the monument at the cemetery. These were real people. They were young guys. Their average age of all 29 was 23. Now, there's a couple tonight we're going to talk about that were in their early 30s. They kind of skewed, but they were 19, 20, 20. They were just out of high school, many of them, and that was the average age. Every one of them left Libertyville thinking they were going to come home. Nobody left thinking they were going to come home. 7 were married before they left. 2 had kids that were born after they went overseas that they never saw. So most of these guys, they never came back. They never, the GI Bill, never went to college, never had, never grew old, never got to see what Libertyville looks like today. They sacrificed all that for the rest of us, which is why it's important we tell the story. But I want you to see their faces as we go through it, because I think that's the most important thing. I did use AI to clean up some of their photographs, because if you go back in time and you look at their pictures, the quality of the picture. So I used some pretty cool tools to kind of either take existing photos and fix them up, or I did composites of what these guys look like. One thing I have to go through, we were talking about this earlier, before I get into, because you're going to hear this on each guy, is something I learned that many people don't know, is that when all these Americans, and there were 400,000 that died overseas, they were buried where they fell, in Europe or in the Pacific. And they stayed there for 3 or 4 or 5 years until the government could go back and get them after the war was over. If you think about the logistics, there was no way during the war that they could bring 400,000 people to the United States. And one of the things, whether it was a Pacific island or somewhere in Europe, as soon as American forces went forward, the CBs or the combat engineers were right behind them. And they scoped out cemeteries, temporary, and they dug long ditches. And the guys were buried in blankets, canvas halves, shelter halves, mattress covers. Everyone was done that way. And then they were covered over, marked with a marker. We went back to get them a number of years later, but they laid there in all those places for anywhere from 4 to 5 years sometimes, until we came back and got them again. And so you'll see that. So what happened in 1947 was the government funded something called the Return of the Dead program. And that's what went to parents. Now, you could think after all those years of war, they could come up with a more gentle name, Return of the Dead, but that's what it was. And it gave parents a equal choice of bringing their child back to the United States for burial here, like the 5 that are in Lakeside Cemetery, or being buried in a permanent American military cemetery overseas. So you can imagine the effort that went in to finding, identifying the forensics, and then bringing them all in a dignified manner back to the U.S. And it's described in the book, but I talk about it at the end of each one of these and say it once before we get into all the rest. One of the things people ask me before we talk about the guys is why the title of 29 Knocks on the Door. During the war, we had 420 dead, 600,000 wounded, and many, many more missing. The only practical way for the government to notify families of a casualty was a telegram, Western private telegram service, or a government. And that's where the knock on the door came from, because what would happen was the messenger would go to the door, knock on the door, and an envelope inside was the yellow telegram, and KIA in large letters, WIA, or A. And it said, the Secretary of War regrets to inform you that your son has been killed on the island of Okinawa, 7 of April, 1945. That's it. That's what they were told. And in most cases, they never knew what happened to them, never knew where they were buried for 3 or 4 years. They never knew where they were killed. They never knew it, unless they had a company commander, a chaplain, or a buddy tell them. The families I've contacted never understood. What 29 Knocks on the Door has to do with the telegram knock on the door. As I put in volume 2, in truth, there were more than 29 knocks on the door, because these guys were wounded once, went back into action, and then were killed. Got a second knock on the door. They were listed as missing once, got a knock on the door, and then were found later or declared dead, and the family got a second knock on the door. So there were more than 29. The covers of each book are very intentional. So the first cover is of a representative house in Libertyville in the 1940s. It's from the perspective of the messenger coming up to the house. The front door's open. It's a nice day. The flag is blowing in the breeze, and the family inside has absolutely no idea what's about to happen. And so you see it from the messenger who comes. I wanted to do something different for the second book. So my daughter-in-law Gita, who's here tonight, came up with the idea of how about we do it from the inside, from the perspective of the person in the house who hears the knock on the door, doesn't know who's there, and goes to see who it is. In either case, they got an envelope with tragic news that changed their life really forever. So that was the reason for why the books have a cover the way they do. So I'm going to go into as many of these as we're going to do. And if I get a little behind, I'm going to pick some out that I really want you to talk about. So here's the first one. This is an AI generated photograph from about 5 different pictures of Ralph over time. But it's pretty close. He looked like this. He was a handsome kid. So Ralph Kirkman, he's a good guy to start with because he never lived in Libertyville. His parents did. He was born and raised in Lake Forest, and lived there his whole life until he went off to the war. The reason I say he's a good guy to start with was when Jenny and I put the list together, the 9, only a handful of these guys are born and raised in Libertyville, meaning they were born here, raised here, lived here until they were 18 to 19 and left. Many came in as in 4 or 5 came in high school, and many lived in Roundout, but went to Libertyville High School. Many lived in Mundelein, went to St. Joe's, went to Libertyville High School. So it's just an example of what we see. But they are the 29 that they're all on the memorial, so we're going to talk about. So Ralph was the oldest of 3 kids. His dad ran Garnett's dry goods store in Lake Forest Market Square, underneath the big tower that's still there to the north. He went to Gorton Grade School, which is now a community center. He was a star basketball player. He graduated 3rd in his class at Lake Forest High School in 1943. He was one of the few at the time, or young people at the time, that actually went to college. Most people that in those days didn't go to college. So he went to University of Wisconsin in Madison. He was there a semester, and the Army said, well, you're going to have to come into the Army. So they drafted him in the field artillery. He went to Fort Rucker, Alabama, and he was assigned to the 759th Field Artillery Battalion. And this was a battalion in that it was independent. It wasn't part of any particular division. It served at the pleasure of the commander. So they were trained to go wherever anybody particularly needed them. He came Libertyville. His family moved into a new house, kitty corner from where we are at 206 West Cook Avenue. The house has been renovated, but it's over there today. His dad had taken a job at Ernie Griffith's hardware store, which is County Square restaurant is today. That's where they had the job. So he was here for 2 weeks in his lifetime, but his parents had moved here. After he took his furlough, he went to the Port of New York in February of 40. Landed in France, February 17th. This is after D-Day. And the situation in March of 45 was, by this time, the war only had about less than 2 months left. The Allied forces that pushed Germany out of France, halfway across Germany, and that's where he was. His unit never got close to combat. They were always 60, 80 miles behind the front. So on April 14th, 1945, and this was less than before the war in Europe was over, his unit was in the little Coulter Herberg, Germany. It was at the southern entrance to the Hürtgen Forest. In the 6 months prior was the very bloody Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, right before the Battle of the Bulge. But the Germans were way off in the distance. The problem was, as the Americans advanced, the Germans laid landmines, tank traps, dug ditches, did stuff to. And this little town was an important crossroad, and it had roads that had to be cleared, and they were mined. Instead of waiting for combat engineers to come, they took his artillery battalion and said, go find this. You can imagine what happened. So Ralph on what's called a shoe mine, SCHU 42. It was a wooden box to avoid detection. It did not kill with, it killed with blast force. So when he stepped on it, it killed his lieutenant who was standing next to him, and he had grievous bodily injuries below his waist. So he was evacuated to Aachen, Germany, about 30 miles away. It took all afternoon because the roads were bad, checkpoints. He gets to the hospital. They amputated his feet, and he died that night. Down the door across the street here, April 29th. What was interesting that week was in the obituaries in the paper was Ralph Kirkman, Jack Trinovich, and Lloyd Iverson, all three from Libertyville, the two first books. So three Libertyville people obituary in one single week. And this happened all throughout the war. He was buried in the temporary military cemetery in Margraten in the Netherlands, not too far from where he died. Parents, after they got the note on their dead program, decided to keep him buried over there. And he's buried in what is now the permanent American cemetery in Margraten. But that's Ralph Curtin. This is Ray Kranz. Kranz is a familiar around Libertyville for a number of reasons. He's Raymond Kranz Jr. This is his official picture, which was taken the first day at basic training in San Diego. And the funny thing, you see a lot of these basic training photos from these guys, they all tried to look tough in these pictures. They got the high and tight haircut, staring at the camera. But that was Raymond Kranz. And this is what this stuff looks like. It's in their military files. He was the first cousin, Kranz, who we're not going to talk about tonight. He's on the cemetery walk. So we had a couple pair of cousins, and tonight we're going to talk about a pair of brothers that were killed in the war. His parents were Ray Cleela. Cleela was in that photograph of the gold that I showed you before. He was born August 13, 1922. He went to Rondout grade school because he was living in Rondout. He went to Libertyville High School in the class of 39, but he dropped out after sophomore year. And one of the things when you read the book, a lot of these guys didn't make it through 4 years. And this is even before the war. They just dropped out. There was not a lot of difference in salary between a high school graduate and a college graduate, and they just left to go get a job. In 1940, he joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. And that was a huge program under Franklin Roosevelt to make jobs for men 18 to 25, doing conservation type work, roads and bridges around the country. And he was sent to Idaho to work on stuff out there. He lasted his 6 months, came back, enlisted in the Army, the Marine Corps in Salt Lake City. He was to San Diego. He graduated from basic training. He was sent to Scouts and Sniper School. You only got to Scouts and Sniper School if you were a really good shot. So he did really well in training on his rifle qualification. Sent to Scouts and Sniper. He had a really interesting assignment. His first time out with his Marine regiment. They were sent to Iceland. This is when America was not yet in the war. And they were up there for about a year. And Iceland at the time was governed by England, and the U.S. had to get permission to have their forces come in and protect it. British couldn't protect it. They were too busy at home. So Churchill came one day to review this, and Ray Kranz got to meet Churchill. So that was kind of cool. It was in the Libertyville School newspaper that he did that. When he came back in May of 42, he married his fiancée. Her name was Mary Carnes. If you look at his enlisted physical, it notes that he had a tattoo on his arm with a heart that said Mary. So he married her in May of 42 in Yuma, Arizona. Now, Arizona back in the day was not only a place you could get divorced quick, but you could get married quick, and they did. When he into the Pacific in mid-1942, this was 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide had begun to change. The U.S. had won the Battle of Midway, Battle of Coral Sea. We're about to invade Guadalcanal. His regiment boarded a ship, went to New Zealand for training for a period of time, and then they went to Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was invaded in August of 42, and that fight went on for some time. And it wasn't going, which is why they needed more Marines there when he came. His unit was supposed to drive the Japanese up the north coast of Guadalcanal to a place called Cape Esperance. As the Marines and the Army got closer, they were driving the Japanese out. They launched a furious artillery and mortar barrage, and he laid there for about 3 years. His wife received the notification from the Return of the Dead program, but by 1947, she had remarried. So of these 7 guys that were married, 6 of their spouses were remarried at one point, including his wife, Mary. When she got the notice, the knock on the door, she was living across the street from here in the public service building on the 2nd floor, which is now the bank building right across from where we are. So it defaulted to his parents that had to make the choice, and they elected to bring him to the North Shore Garden of Memories in North Chicago. So he didn't come home until May 5th of 1948. So very typical. Things happened in 48, 49 when they all came home. So that's Ray Kranz Jr. Here's Paul Christon. Paul Christon is one of the guys my dad talked to me about. When I was a kid, he knew Paul. He knew his brother Pete. His brother Pete came back from the war and founded Christon Funeral Home that's still there in Mundelein. But Paul grew up in unincorporated Libertyville out near Ascension Cemetery. His dad, Leo, was the first caretaker at Ascension Cemetery when it opened up in the late 1920s. And they lived in a little house right off of the property out there. Paul is probably one of the most, as Dale will tell you, distinguished athletes at Libertyville High School: basketball, football, and track, varsity letter winner. He was older than most kids. I don't know if he was held back. I don't think he was, because he was very smart, or if he was sick. That oftentimes happened. And so he was older than his classmates. So after his junior year in the summer of 43, he was drafted. So the Army didn't care if you were in high school. If you were 19 and you had to go, you went. And so he left. He didn't go back for his senior year. Kathy Wepler is with us tonight in the back. You can wave, Kathy. She's a very familiar Libertyville name. You know her Wepler name, but her mom was a tailor. Her grandfather was Charles Taylor Sr., who owned Taylor Drugstore right here in that same building across the corner. And her mom was Janet Taylor from the class of 43. Janet Taylor was engaged to Paul Christon before he left to go overseas. So, and I interviewed Kathy for the book, and we had a lot of fun talking about this. He was a smart guy. He did really well on his military qualification tests. And so they made him a combat medic. They called it a medical aid man, but it's the combat medic. Now, combat medics, you've seen them all on TV. Somebody yells out medic and some guy comes running up. He's got an aid bag. They typically had a big white circle with a red cross on their helmets. They wore it on their arm. Germans did the same thing because they tried not to shoot at they were not armed, the combat medics. He went down to Texas for medic training, was attached to a medical detachment. His medical detachment was sent to the 1st Infantry Division. It's a very fabled Army division called the Big Run One. They landed at Omaha Beach on June 6th. His regiment was not scheduled to land until +1, which was June 7th. So he sat in a boat offshore, as many of them did, watching the greatest invasion in history, because they came ashore the second day. So he watched the rest of the 1st Infantry and all the rest of them come forward and land on that beach. They were out there that night after the first day of the invasion, and they could see the fires and they could see the artillery. And then he came across and landed the next day with his medical regiment on June 7th, and they had to get through all the burning vehicles on the beach and the corpses that were in the water and the fires that were burning. And he wrote a letter home and talked about this, but that's what Paul had to go through before he even got into France. He was also came aboard at the time where the 1st Infantry began to push the Germans back across France and into Germany. Paul Christon was awarded the Silver Star 2 times. And Silver Star is our country's 3rd highest honor for valor in combat. There were 100,000 Silver Stars given in World War II. Less than 5,000 were given twice. He got it twice. In 1 month, he did it. So he was a pretty brave guy. And I'm pretty sure he used his athletic skills, because you had to move from person to person. They were assigned at the company level, which meant he was right where people were getting hurt. And so 2 times he was awarded the Silver Star. On the morning of November 19th, 1944, his infantry regiment was awarded to attack the crossroads town of Schevenhütten, a little town in Germany. The Germans saw 2 battalions coming after them, responded with a furious artillery attack, and he was killed by shell fragments in the back. So here was the guy that took care of everybody else, and he ended up getting killed in November of 1944. He was buried at Henri Chapelle Temporary Cemetery in Belgium. The knock on the door of the family home on Buckley Road came on December 9th. Later that month, his mom got a letter from his company commander telling her of Paul's bravery. He died instantly. He did not die of pain. They were one of the few families that actually heard from somebody as to what happened to their son. In 1947, when they were given the choice of location, his mother wrote to the government, "Please bury our boy beside his comrades with whom he fought and died in permanent resting place in an American military cemetery overseas." So Henri Chapelle became a permanent American cemetery, and that's where Paul Christon is buried. Paul Vetchel Matthews. He's another guy that lived in Libertyville for a very short period of time. His grandfather served in the Union Army during the Civil War, saw action at the Siege of Atlanta and Sherman's March to the Sea. I told you I researched these guys going way back in time. There's some really fascinating stories about their ancestors. He was born on the family farm here in 1920 in Grant Township. His grew up there. There's no real record of him going to school anywhere in Lake County or part of McHenry County, but he did. Uh, he appears in Libertyville in February of 1942. He took a job at Folds Milling Company, which at the time, of course, was the biggest employer in town. He rented a house at 401 First Street, which is right across from where the two lumber companies were. He did a lot of stuff this in 1942. So he comes to Libertyville, works at Folds. In October, get married to a girl named Rosie Vogt from Palatine, moves out of Libertyville, goes down to a carriage house where her parents lived in Palatine and lived there. Decides to join the Army, which he did right after that, after they were married. He went to Camp Roberts, California. He became part of the 165th Regiment, and he participated in the Battle of the Macon Atoll, which is one of the first battles of the Island Hopping Campaign in World War II. His unit returned to Hawaii and then went back to Saipan. Now, if you know anything about the Battle of Saipan, it was one of the worst battles of World War II. When it was over, the casualty ratios for America were so great, they developed something called the Saipan ratio, which was they saw how many Americans dead it took to kill so many Japanese. And what they did was they used that as the calculation for what would happen if we invaded the Japanese home islands. And that's where they came up with the notion of anywhere from 500,000 to a million Americans would die if we invaded Japan. It was called the Saipan ratio. And that's where he fought. He had the unfortunate chance to be in a defensive position in July of that year when the Japanese commander ordered the largest single banzai charge, suicide charge of the war. 3,500 Japanese came out of the hill and down and decimated several American regiments and killed Paul Matthews in the process. He was buried at a temporary cemetery on Saipan, and his wife had given birth to their son, Merle, almost 1 year to the day that he was killed. She remarried in 1947, so the choice of where he was buried defaulted to his parents. An interesting story, his parents could not read or write, so his sister had to sign the disinterment directive and where his choice of burial location would be. He was buried at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, very close to Ole Ekstrom and Jack Chernovich from Libertyville as well. So that's Paul Matthews. Now we have the Perkis brothers. There were two Perkis brothers. I'm going to talk about Richard, and I'll talk about his brother Roy. Okay. So they grew up in Waukegan and Lake Bluff. And Richard only briefly, as I'll explain, went to LHS, and his mother only lived here for a short period of time. So they were really from Lake Bluff and Lake Forest, but they got counted. So for Roy, he graduated from Lake Bluff School in 1926. He dropped out of Deerfield High School, and he went to work here in Libertyville at a pen company that used to be over on Church Street, a very well-known fountain pen company. His brother joined him there later. Both guys were married. Roy married a woman named May Fabry of Lake Forest. Richard married a woman named Joyce Jones. By then, the brothers were working at a wholesale company downtown. Their mom lived on 2nd Street for about 3 months. She got a job at Abbott, and she used to take the North Shore line, the electric line, over to Lake Bluff and then over to Abbott. But she lived there just a short period of time before going back again. An interesting story about the Perkis families was the dad died when they were all very young. And it's 4 kids. And at one point, the mom couldn't take care of them. So she put them in a place that was called the Methodist Deaconess Home. It was an orphanage in Lake Bluff. I didn't know this existed, but it was pretty good size. And what was curious about the Deaconess movement was they would take kids temporarily. But he wasn't really an orphan, but she couldn't take care of him. So put 4 kids in this orphanage. And they mainstreamed them. They went to school. They did activities. They were in the Boy Scouts. They did all these different things. They just weren't living at home. And it took about 4 years before she get back on her feet and get her kids back with her again at some point in time. So we'll go back to Richard. He was drafted in September of 42. He went to the 29th Infantry Division in Louisiana. The 29th did not land on D-Day until about a month after the invasion in July of 1944. What ended up happening with Richard was his regiment was advancing towards the Siegfried line. This was Germany's reinforced line between France and Germany. And he was killed in a surprise counterattack that the Germans had. He was buried overseas. His brother was killed 6 months later. Now, one of the things that happened was in the Return of the Dead program, the government was very specific about making sure that any brothers, 2, 3, 4, When they were disinterred and brought back to the United States, they were brought back together. So when you look at because they didn't want families to go through this multiple times. So if you look at the military records and you look at these directives, at the top of the Perkins brothers in big red letters, it says brothers. And that was the clue for the graves registration people to make absolutely certain that they were brought back on specially prepared ships that brought the dead back, and they were transported to a depot in Chicago, and they were brought up together to Lake Forest to be buried. So it's a sad thing that happened, but that is one of the things that came on. So that's Richard and Roy. This is William Rich Jr. Very interesting background. His dad came from Italy in 1909. His name was Guglielmo Resta, R-E-S-T-A. His brother, Vincenzo, came a year later in 1910. They anglicized their names shortly after they got here, which a lot of immigrants did. They wanted American-sounding names. So William Rich's dad became William Rich, and his brother became James Rast, W-R-A-S-T. William Rich is the cousin of Clement Rast, who we will talk about towards the end. So another pair of cousins that we had. His dad was a very colorful character, William Rich Sr. He worked for the railroad, but in Prohibition, he owned an ice cream store, which was not an ice cream store. It was a place to sell booze. And his dad ran into all kinds of problems with the law over time. He was really an interesting guy. William Jr. went to Rondout Grade School. He received all the sacraments at St. Joe's in Libertyville. He was a member of the class in 1940. His tenure was pretty uneventful. When you look at the yearbooks, you don't see much of him. His nickname was Willie. He was 5'9", 150 pounds. This is important because I'll tell you in a minute what he was assigned to do. He worked a little bit after graduation at Great Lakes in construction. He entered the Army. He was assigned to the Army Air Forces, and he became a ball turret gunner. So if you know anything about a B-17 bomber, they were bristling with machine guns. There was a tail gunner, gunners up on top in the turret, gunners in the front, gunners on the side, and the ball turret gunner. The ball turret gunner was probably the most dangerous position of many dangerous positions on the thing. And he had to be a little guy to get in this plexiglass ball that hung underneath the bomber. And the ball turret would spin 360 degrees and then 90 degrees straight down. Okay. And it was hydraulically controlled, and it could move really quick. It could keep up with fighters. You had to be well trained to do this. And to get into this ball, he had to climb in. The ball was up 3/4 of the way into the airplane at takeoff. When they thought the fighters were coming, he would work his way down inside. You're almost laying back like this. His knees were up. His legs were on either side of the two machine guns and the ammunition canisters. So he's in this claustrophobic space in this little ball, spinning back and forth and shooting people. The ball turret was a tough place to be because if they ever had a problem with hydraulics, they could never, if they were shot, they could never get out. So ball turret gun was a tough position. And that's what he did. He was in a bomber called the Nip and Tuck 2. There were 10 guys on a B-17. He was one of them. Nip and Tuck 2 got to England in October of 1943. They prepared for a couple of missions. They flew during what was called Black Week. It was an awful time for American lost thousands of airmen and aircraft during Black Week over Germany. He participated in Black Thursday, which is the raid on the Schweinfurt ball bearings factory, and one of the few planes that actually came back. So they saw action really quick when they got over there. On the last mission he went on, they were on a target to go over Berlin. And when they got to Berlin, cloud cover aborted the mission, and they kept the bombs in the plane, turned around, and they were going back to England. And they had no fighters, no flak going over. And they thought, well, this is pretty good. Turned around, they were heading back for the couple-hour trip back to England. Over Holland, they were intercepted by 40 German fighter planes flying from a big air base at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. Schiphol Airport is still there. One of the planes got through. The American fighter escort broke up a lot of it, but one of the planes got through. The German pilot was a 26-year-old German air ace named Werner Lucas. He began to shoot at Nip and Tuck 2, and the plane soon caught on fire and began to spin out of control. The co-pilot and the top gunner got out. He kept shooting, and because the bombs were still on the plane, a couple seconds later, the plane exploded in 1,000 pieces. Came down in a little town called Venray, Holland. There were enough of the crew left that the townspeople buried. And this typically happened in the air war over Europe when Allied flyers came down and they were killed. the local townspeople would bury them in the municipal cemetery. Either the pastor of the local church or the Lord Mayor, town mayor, would come and do it. And so he was buried there, but the plane was all over the place. It took until 3 years after he was listed as missing in action. His parents didn't know he was dead for 3 years. And it took until the forensic teams got into Holland, found his aircraft, found where he was buried, because they had to go ask the townspeople where he was. And that's what happened to him. What an interesting side story is that the guy that shot him down was killed 4 days later. He was shot down by a British Spitfire over the town of Leiden, Holland. And the side story with him is his plane was crashing, and he had a choice of crashing into a hospital or crashing into another place, or hitting a hospital. And he crashed into a different place. It was a Catholic hospital run by Franciscan sisters. So the German pilot chose to kill himself as opposed to. And the nuns after the war put up a plaque in honor of the same guy that shot down William Rich. Now, one of the interesting things is in Holland and in Belgium, there's a lot of organizations that still honor American veterans. And in Holland in particular, they find the crash sites of Allied American air crews, and they found his. And there's a roadside memorial set up to him, and every year and his family's been there for this memorial. So William Rich is memorialized over there as well. This is James Ritzenthaler. He grew up in Prairie View, which is kind of about where Stevenson High School is now, kind of Buffalo Grove, Vernon Hills. There was no Vernon Hills in those days. His parents' family had come from Alsace, France. His mom was a teacher at Prairie View School, and his dad was a very successful dairy farmer. His nickname was Ritz. He was in Libertyville High School in the class of 42. He was a classmate of Lloyd Iverson, who was one of the 4 Marines that was killed at the Battle of Okinawa. He played in the school orchestra and the band. He played the French horn, and that's what he was musically inclined. He sang in the choir as he was growing up. He did go to the University of Illinois for about a year. He dropped out and became a truck driver. Made a lot of money, a lot more money than he's going to make in college. Did that for about a year. And then he decided in June of 1944 to enlist in the Marine Corps. He was sent out to San Diego. He was trained on a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun. And by this time of the war, he was in a replacement draft, it was called. So guys were being trained as replacements and then sent to units. Unlike the first guys that went, who were part of a unit that trained here and they all worked together. He was going to get sent off to someplace he had no idea where it was. So he went to training in Hawaii, and then he was sent to participate in the invasion of Iwo Jima. If you know anything about the Battle of Iwo Jima, as the battles got north in the island hopping campaign, Saipan, Peleliu, Guam, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, they got worse and worse and worse. And Iwo Jima, of course, was a really bad one. The invasion started February 19th. He came ashore February 24th. He was killed March 1st. He had like 2 days to get to know his new unit before he was killed in the Japanese counterattack. He was buried on Iwo Jima as well in the temporary military cemetery. It was after the war, his parents brought him back to Knopf Cemetery in Prairie View. A couple things about him. One of his uncles survived the war and came back, and he's the guy that founded Ritzenthaler Bus Lines. It was here in Lake County for many, many years. And his other uncle was the stepfather of Jack Cherinovich from First One. So when I told you the town was small and everything was interconnected, I wasn't kidding. Everybody knew everybody, and everybody was part of each other. This is Alfred Schwambach. He was a little older than some of these guys, born in 1918. His dad was the groundskeeper at Knollwood Club in Knollwood, and they lived on the grounds. And so he was a golfer, among other things. He went to Libertyville High School. He was in the class of 35. His brother died. He was 16 years old right after Alfred graduated from high school. He was a caddy at Knollwood. He and 3 of his buddies went to Liberty Lake right out here on 176, and his brother drowned that afternoon. His dad died a couple of years later. Alfred worked at the Kraft Phoenix Cheese Company, which used to be on North Milwaukee Avenue, about across the street from where St. Joe's is right now. It was a distribution center. So it was Kraft Cheese. It was called Phoenix Kraft Cheese. He went into the Army, was assigned to the Army Air Forces, and he became a navigator. He went through all the navigation training that took place. He had a pretty smart guy. So when you went into the Army Air Forces as an officer, you were either going to be a pilot, navigator, or a bombardier. He became a navigator. And he was assigned to a school in Louisiana, and he was in his final stage of learning how to be a navigator. And they had one long class they had to do. They flew in an airplane from Louisiana to Amarillo, Texas. They had to land and then come back again. So this airplane he was on was a cargo plane. It was like a flying classroom. There were 4 cadets. He was an aviation cadet learning to be navigators and the 3 pilots. They made it successfully to Texas. When they turned around in a half an hour and took the flight back, the plane took off. It flew for about a quarter of a mile, got up to 500 feet, and went straight into the ground at about 200 miles an hour. One of the engines was buried 8 feet underground. So Alfred was killed. In those days, if you died in the United States or were killed, you didn't get a telegram knock on the door. Somebody called your family, and he was sent back to be buried. Just shortly after that, he's buried in Vernon Township Cemetery. Robert Frank Vesley. This is one of the ones I'm never quite sure how he got on the list because he died after the war was over. He was born in North Chicago, lived briefly in Libertyville. His parents had come from Bohemia. His father was a butcher, had a shop in North Chicago, moved to Mundelein, had the Royal Blue Market in Mundelein. So during that time, he went to Lincoln School, then he went to Libertyville High School. Another one that dropped out after his freshman year. At some point, about 1945, he joins the Army Air Forces, did not go overseas. He was an administrator. He went to Greensboro, North Carolina, and he worked in a unit that during the war would process airmen from the United States over to England. By the time he got there, the war was over, and they were now bringing people back from Europe through there. And so he made sure records were straight. He did all this stuff. And in February of 46, of course, this is after the war was over, he was admitted to the hospital with severe abdominal pain. He was diagnosed with acute pancreatitis. It's just a tough disease. Even today, there's not a lot of things you can do for pancreatitis. He ended up developing hemorrhaging in his abdomen, and they couldn't stop it, and he died. He was a very young guy. He was brought back to the Ray Burnett Funeral Home here in Libertyville, and he was also buried in the North Shore Garden of Memories. One of the things I kept track of as we went through the book is when these guys came back, where did they come back to? So Ray Burnett Funeral Home, which is now Burnett Dane, probably handled most of them. What became McMurrow did the rest for those that came back to here. So when you see that in the book, you'll understand why. This is Paul Wood Jr. He was a P-51 fighter pilot during the war. He grew up in other places, California, Arlington Heights, came to Libertyville High School as a sophomore, was a football player, varsity Leonard winner, good guy, good looking kid, very well thought of, joined the Army, went through the aviation program, became a fighter pilot. So we went through flight school in World War II. You were really, really good if you became a fighter pilot. He was really, really good. Went to England after he went through training, flying the new P-51B. In June, right after D-Day of 1944, he was on a mission. He shot down 2 German planes, got himself in the newspaper for doing that. A week later, he shot down 2 more German planes, got himself in the newspaper for doing that. He was one short of being an ace. So very quickly upon his arrival, he was a pretty good fighter pilot, shot down 4 German aircraft. On the morning of June 29th, 1944, they were escorting some bombers over Berlin. And he radioed his wingman that he had engine trouble. He was going to turn back somewhere over Germany and head back to England. The weird thing is, instead of going northwest back to England, he actually crashed southeast about 100 miles in a little town called Elm. And he was buried in the municipal cemetery. It took 3 years to find him. There's a whole story behind how this happened. And it's mysterious how he got there instead of going in the opposite direction. There were conflicting stories from the townspeople. They claimed they shot him down. There was no anti-aircraft guns in the little town. He crashed, but they don't know why. They don't know how. It took 3 years to find him. And they brought him back, and his parents had him buried at the National Military Cemetery in San Francisco. Got just a couple more guys here. This is Clement Rast. His cousin was William Rich. His dad was Vincenzo Resta when he came over, and he became James Rast. They lived over on 4th Street. He was an athlete at Libertyville High School. You can see him there wearing his Letterman's sweater. He joined the Army in 1942. Was sent to Camp Callan, California, north of San Diego, to learn how to be an anti-aircraft artilleryman. He was at basic training 2 weeks when he died of cardiac arrest. And I'm not sure why. It was pulmonary edema. Curiously, his company commander was a physician in the real world that had been recalled to active duty. And so when he called the parents, he was able to relay to them what happened to Clement, but he died of a heart attack at a very young age. So it's sort of unusual for a guy that was very athletic to have that happen. And an unfortunate side note is he wasn't the only Libertyville person to die on that day in 1942. Mike Bedla, who's in volume 1, he's a Marine that was killed on Guadalcanal at exactly the same time that Clement died in his barracks in San Diego. And then our last one is Sergeant Norman Ulrich, Celia's brother. He was born and raised in Mundelein, graduated from Libertyville High School in 1939. Was born at home in Ivanhoe. His dad was a contractor, as we know. After high school, or actually during school, he went to St. Joe's for grade school. Santa Maria was not there yet. When he was in 8th grade and Santa Maria Church opened, he served the first mass with the pastor. After high school, he did work for his dad. In 1943, he joined the 1094th Signal Group. I had no idea this existed. There were 4 of them in the Army in World War II. Big unit, and they would go wherever the Air Force went, and they would do communications for half the Pacific region. And this is what Norman did. He was he was a smart guy. He was in a very interesting unit. He was first sent to New Guinea. And if you know anything about the war, the Battle of New Guinea just took forever. And he was there for a period of time. Then his unit was sent to Leyte in the Philippines as General MacArthur was invading the Philippines at the end of 1944. He was sent to a place called Bury Airstrip. There were 3 airstrips in the place that he went. The Japanese commander was very concerned that the Americans had these 3 airstrips because he knew if they had them, it would cut off his supplies, cut off his ability to reach the mainland, Japan. And so he decided in a desperate attack on these 3 airstrips. He was going to do 2 airborne assaults. The Japanese didn't do very many parachute drops, but they did 2. On Bury Airstrip, where Norman was, they couldn't do that. So the Japanese came out of the hills at 6 o'clock in the morning. The airstrip where he was very lightly defended. They went through the tents and they killed the Americans in the morning. They finally were sent off in the afternoon, but Norman died that afternoon. His family did get a letter from his company commander that he had not suffered. He had been laid to rest that same day, and he had a Catholic priest attending his burial, and he's buried out at St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery in Fremont Center with many of Celia's family. So he's one of the 3 guys from Mundelein that I picked up. So that's a cross-section of the 29. If you want to know the real stories, get the book and you'll see for yourself. I did bring books tonight. Okay, I think I have 6 of each of the 3 books. If you want one, I ask you to make a donation to the Historical Society. You do what I'm not going to ask you what it is, just do it. If there's not enough books, there's a sign-up sheet, and give me your name and your email address, and I will contact you and I'll get you a book. Okay, if you want one tonight, I'll stick around and sign it for you as well. But so that's the chronology of the 3 books that form the trilogy of the 29 Dead here in Libertyville, and I'm done writing books for a while. So if anybody's got any great ideas, let me know. But that's what we have. So thank you very much for listening tonight at the church.